There is a place in California where the air will kill you. Not metaphorically, not eventually, in the way that pollution kills you slowly, accumulating over decades until your lungs give out at 73. Actually, kill you. The kind of kill that shows up in emergency rooms. The kind that gives children asthma before they are old enough to ride a bicycle. The kind that coats the inside of your respiratory tract with arsenic, selenium, and pesticide residue that has been sitting in a dry lakebed for 50 years, waiting for the wind. It is 3 hours from Los Angeles. It is 2 hours from San Diego. It is surrounded by some of the most productive farmland in the United States. Farmland that feeds a significant portion of the country's winter vegetables. Farmland that employs hundreds of thousands of workers who live in the communities closest to it. And almost no one outside of California has ever heard of it. The Salton Sea. It is not a sea. It has never been a sea. It is an accident, a man-made lake in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, created by an engineering failure in 1905, expanded by agricultural runoff for a century, and now dying in a way that is taking the communities around it down with it. The water is receding. It has been receding for decades, and as the water retreats, it exposes a lakebed saturated with a century's worth of agricultural chemicals, heavy metals, and pesticide residue. A lakebed that the desert wind picks up and carries into the lungs of 400,000 people who live in the Imperial and Coachella valleys below. This is not a story about an environmental disaster that happened. It is a story about an environmental disaster that is happening right now, that has been happening for 30 years, that every level of California's government has known about, studied, planned around, and with a consistency that borders on policy, failed to address. This is the story of the Salton Sea. And it starts, as so many American disasters do, with someone deciding to make the desert bloom. The Imperial Valley in the early 20th century was one of the most inhospitable places in North America. It sits below sea level, in some places, more than 70 meters below. The summer temperature regularly exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall is under 80 millimeters. The soil is, by most measures, remarkably fertile ancient lake sediment, deposited over millions of years, rich with the minerals that plants need. But without water, soil is just geology. Without water, the Imperial Valley was just a very hot, very empty, very inhospitable piece of the American Southwest. So they brought the water. The California Development Company began diverting water from the Colorado River into the Imperial Valley in 1901. The project was audacious and, for several years, successful. The desert responded to irrigation, the way deserts always respond, with extraordinary productivity. By 1904, the Imperial Valley was producing cotton, melons, lettuce, and grain. Settlers arrived. Towns were platted and built. The promise of the American West that any land, however hostile, could be made to yield with sufficient engineering seemed to be proving itself. Then, in the winter of 1905, the intake canal silted up. The engineers attempted to bypass the blockage with a temporary cut in the canal wall. The cut was made without a headgate, without any mechanism to control the flow if the river ran higher than expected. In the spring of 1905, the Colorado River flooded. The floodwaters poured through the uncontrolled cut, and for the next 18 months, the entire flow of the Colorado River ran not into the Gulf of California, where it belonged, but into the Salton Sea, the lowest point of the Imperial Valley where no water had stood for more than 1,000 years. By the time Southern Pacific Railroad, under pressure from President Theodore Roosevelt, managed to close the breach in February 1907, the Salton Sea existed 50 kilometers long, 20 kilometers wide, 75 billion gallons of water sitting in a desert basin with no natural outlet and no natural inflow. Nothing to replace what the desert heat would evaporate, and no mechanism to drain what was there. No one knew what to do with it. For a while, people decided to enjoy it. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Salton Sea was a resort destination. This is not a joke or an exaggeration. It was genuinely, legitimately, enthusiastically developed as a recreational lake. The fish population, stocked with corvina, tilapia, and other species, was abundant. The weather was warm. The water was calm. Hotels and marinas were built on the shoreline. It always had been. The problem was chemistry. The problem was always going to be chemistry. The Salton Sea has no natural outlet. Water flows in from agricultural drainage, from the new Alamo, and whitewater rivers from whatever the Imperial irrigation district sends its way. The only thing that leaves is evaporation. The water evaporates. The salts and minerals and chemicals dissolved in the water do not. They stay. They accumulate. Every year, the water that flows in brings more dissolved solids. Every year, the evaporation concentrates what is already there. By the 1970s, the salinity of the Salton Sea was already exceeding that of the Pacific Ocean. By the 1980s, the fish were dying. By the 1990s, the hotels were empty, the marinas were abandoned, and the shoreline that had once hosted Frank Sinatra was coated in a white mineral crust and the decomposing bodies of millions of fish. The tourists left. They did not come back. What they left behind was 400,000 people, agricultural workers, their families, their children living in the communities around a body of water that was visibly, measurably, rapidly becoming something dangerous. Here is what the Salton Sea contains. A century of agricultural runoff from one of the most intensively farmed regions in the United States has deposited into the lakebed. A catalog of chemicals that reads like an inventory of everything the 20th century did wrong. DDT, a pesticide banned in the United States in 1972. Decades after its catastrophic effects on bird reproduction were documented by Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. DDT is persistent. It does not break down in soil. It does not break down in sediment. The DDT that was sprayed on Imperial Valley fields in the 1950s and 1960s is still in the lakebed of the Salton Sea. It'll be there for generations. Selenium, a naturally occurring element that, in trace amounts, is an essential nutrient for animals and humans alike. In the concentrations found in the Salton Sea, concentrated by a century of agricultural drainage and raw selenium causes deformities in birds, disrupts reproductive systems, damages the liver and kidneys, and has been detected in fish tissue at levels that make those fish unsafe for human consumption. Arsenic, chromium, lead, pesticide residue from decades of agricultural application, fertilizer runoff, carrying nitrates and phosphates that feed the algal blooms that periodically turn the water green and consume its oxygen, killing the fish that remain. And beneath all of it, in the lakebed sediment, all of it, dried out and exposed to the desert wind. As the waterline retreats, the Salton Sea is currently losing approximately 1 meter of shoreline every year. As it retreats, it exposes new lakebed. New lakebed dries in the desert sun. The wind picks it up. The wind does not distinguish between harmless dust and dust contaminated with DDT, arsenic, and selenium. It carries all of it together in particles small enough to penetrate deep into the lungs, into the communities downwind. The Imperial Valley has the worst air quality of any region in California. It has some of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the United States. In some communities around the Salton Sea, the rate of childhood asthma is more than twice the national average. These are not coincidences. They are consequences. The people who live around the Salton Sea are not the people that California usually talks about when it talks about California. They are not the people in the tech industry or the film industry or the wine industry. They are not the people in the coastal cities whose concerns dominate the state's political conversation. They are agricultural workers, most of them Latino, most of them poor, many of them undocumented, people whose legal status makes it difficult to advocate for themselves, difficult to access health care, difficult to hold anyone accountable for what the air is doing to their children's lungs. The communities of Mecca, Thermal, Coachella, and the Salton Sea's eastern shore have median household incomes that place them among the lowest in California. They have among the highest rates of poverty, the lowest rates of educational attainment, and the highest rates of environmentally caused disease. They live, in other words, at the intersection of every disadvantage that a society can impose on a community. And then, on top of all of that, they live downwind of a dying toxic lake. Environmental justice researchers have a term for this. They call it the sacrifice zone, a geography that a society has decided can be sacrificed to the economic and environmental needs of the broader population. A place where the costs of development, of agriculture, of a century of resource extraction are deposited because the people who live there do not have the political power to refuse them. The Imperial Valley is a sacrificed zone. The Salton Sea is what a sacrifice zone looks like when the bill finally comes due. California has known about this for a long time. The ecological collapse of the Salton Sea was not a surprise. It was not a sudden revelation. Scientists have been documenting the salinity rise, the fish die-offs, the bird mortality, the receding shoreline, and the toxic dust exposure for decades. There have been reports, there have been studies, there have been task forces, commissions, legislative hearings, and governor's declarations. In 2003, the Salton Sea Restoration Act directed the state to develop a restoration plan. The plan was developed. It was not funded. In 2017, a landmark water transfer agreement between the Imperial Irrigation District and San Diego's Water Authority was finalized, that had been years in negotiation, and that everyone involved understood would significantly reduce the agricultural drainage flowing into the Salton Sea, accelerating the shrinkage. As part of that agreement, the state committed to spending $250 million on habitat restoration and dust suppression at the sea. The money was allocated. Projects began. They were too small, too slow, and drastically underfunded relative to the scale of the problem. By 2023, approximately 55,000 acres of lakebed had been exposed. The state's restoration projects had addressed approximately 10,000 acres. The state of California, it is worth noting, has a budget measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The total cost of a comprehensive Salton Sea restoration, one that would actually address the dust exposure, stabilize the shoreline, and begin the long process of ecological recovery, has been estimated at between $9 and $33 billion. That is a wide range, because no one has fully agreed on what comprehensive restoration actually means. But even at the high end, $33 billion is approximately 3% of a single year of California's state budget. It has not been spent. It will not be spent this year. The communities downwind of the Salton Sea will continue breathing the same air they have been breathing for 30 years. There is a particular cruelty in the geography of this disaster. The Imperial Valley produces roughly $1 billion worth of crops every year. It supplies a significant proportion of the winter vegetables consumed across the United States. Lettuce and broccoli and carrots that appear in supermarkets from December through March, when nothing is growing in the north. The agricultural system that built the Imperial Valley, that made it productive. That continues to generate that $1 billion of output. That system is the same system that created the Salton Sea, that filled it with agricultural runoff, that concentrated its toxins, and that is now exposing its lakebed as water is diverted away from agriculture toward the cities that are willing to pay more for it. The people who harvest those crops live in the communities being poisoned by the dust. The people who eat those crops live in cities whose water agencies negotiated the transfers that accelerated the shrinkage. Their relationship is not hidden. It is not a conspiracy. It is written plainly in the water transfer agreements, in the agricultural production statistics, in the epidemiological data on childhood asthma in the Imperial Valley. One community produces the food and absorbs the toxins. Another community eats the food and drinks the water and does not particularly think about where either comes from. This is not unique to the Salton Sea. It is the operating logic of the American food system. What is unique to the Salton Sea is how visible it is, how impossible to miss. If you are willing to look, the line between who pays the cost and who receives the benefit, the birds still come. This is, in some ways, the most heartbreaking part of the story. The Salton Sea, despite everything, despite the salinity, despite the algal blooms, despite the fish die-offs, despite the selenium and the arsenic and the DDT, remains one of the most important bird habitats in North America. It sits on the Pacific Flyway, the migration corridor that runs along the western coast of the continent, and it is one of the only significant bodies of water within hundreds of kilometers in any direction. For migratory birds, it is not a choice between the Salton Sea and a better lake. It is a choice between the Salton Sea and nothing. So they come. More than 400 species have been recorded there. Pelicans, egrets, herons, eared grebes. Hundreds of thousands of birds landing on a body of water that has selenium concentrations high enough to cause reproductive failure, high enough to cause deformities in the eggs that hatch, high enough that biologists have documented birds born without functional eyes. In 1992, a single event killed more than 150,000 eared grebes. The cause was never definitively established, but avian cholera and the general toxicity of the water were both implicated. In 1996, more than 14,000 American white pelicans died in a single dot. In 1999, an avian botulism outbreak killed an estimated 1 million birds over several months. 1 million birds in a single outbreak in California, and it barely made the news. The birds come because they have nowhere else to go, and the thing that is killing them, the same salinity, the same toxins. The same dying ecosystem is also what is killing the people who live there. Different biology, same exposure, same source. There are people who have been fighting this for decades. They are not famous. They are not well-funded. There are community organizers in Mecca and Therma and the unincorporated communities of the eastern Salton Shore. People who grew up there, whose parents grew up there, whose children are growing up there with inhalers and their backpacks because the air in the valley where they live has been poisoning them since before they were born. They have given testimony at legislative hearings. They have organized town halls. They have filed comments in regulatory proceedings. They have driven hours to Sacramento to sit in committee rooms and explain, again, in English and in Spanish, what it is like to raise a child in a community where the air quality index regularly reaches levels that the EPA categorizes as hazardous. They have been heard. They have been thanked. They have been told that the situation is complex, that the funding is limited, that the competing interests are difficult to reconcile, that progress is being made. They drive home. The wind blows. The dust rises off the lakebed. Their children cough. This is what environmental injustice looks like from the inside. Not a villain twirling a mustache. Not a conspiracy to deliberately harm a specific community. Just a slow accumulation of decisions made by people who would never live there. About a place they would never visit, affecting communities that did not have enough votes, or enough money, or enough political connection to make their suffering impossible to ignore. Here is where things stand. The Salton Sea is currently approximately 36% smaller than it was in 2003. It is projected to lose another third of its surface area by 2030, depending on rainfall and water transfer volumes. The exposed lakebed will continue to grow. The dust will continue to blow. The communities downwind will continue to breathe it. California has restoration projects underway. The Species Conservation Habitat Project, a shallow water habitat designed to replace some of the lost ecosystem, is the largest of them. It covers several thousand acres of the exposed southern shoreline. It is, by the account of most independent scientists who have reviewed it, insufficient. A useful beginning, not a solution. The lithium beneath the Salton Sea's southern end has attracted significant interest in recent years. The geothermal brines beneath the Salton Trough contained what may be one of the largest lithium deposits in the world, an element that is essential for electric vehicle batteries, for grid storage, for the energy transition that California has committed itself to. Governor Newsom has called the area Lithium Valley. Billions of dollars of private investment are flowing in. The possibility that the same geology that created the crisis might fund the restoration has been raised, repeatedly, as a reason for optimism. It is a reason for something. Whether it is optimism depends on whether the revenue from lithium extraction actually reaches the communities that have been living with the consequences of a century of resource extraction, or whether it flows, as resource revenue generally flows, to the investors and the state general fund and the communities that did not absorb the costs. That question has not been answered. It may not be answered for years. The Salton Sea is not California's worst disaster because of the scale of what has already happened. It is California's worst disaster because of the scale of what is still happening and still about to happen, and has been knowable and preventable and unfunded for 30 years. Disasters that arrive without warning, earthquakes, wildfires, floods, are tragedies. They are things that happen to people. The Salton Sea is something different. It is a slow-motion catastrophe that was visible at every stage, that was studied and documented and reported on by scientists who knew exactly what was coming. And that was allowed to continue because the people it was happening to were not the people that the political system was designed to protect. That is not a natural disaster. That is a choice made repeatedly, over decades, by people with the power to make a different one. The dust is blowing right now. It is blowing off 45,000 acres of exposed lakebed, carrying arsenic and DDT and selenium into the air of the Imperial Valley, into the lungs of children in Mecca and Thermal, and the communities on the eastern shore. The state budget will be passed this year. The restoration funding will be debated. The communities will send representatives to Sacramento. The committee rooms will be full of people in expensive suits, talking about competing interests and fiscal constraints, and the complexity of the situation, and the dust will keep blowing. The Salton Sea was created by an accident, a canal, an uncontrolled cut, 18 months of a river running where it was never supposed to run. The accident was not the disaster. The disaster is what came after a century of using the accidental lake as a dump for agricultural runoff, followed by a decade of slowly removing the water that had been diluting that runoff, followed by 30 years of watching the exposed lakebed turn into an open-air toxic waste site while the people living next to it asked, repeatedly, for someone to do something. The Salton Sea is not a story about nature gone wrong. It is a story about a society that made a series of decisions about water, about agriculture, about which communities bear the costs of other people's prosperity, and then chose not to revisit those decisions when the consequences became impossible to ignore. The water was always going to evaporate. The toxins were always going to concentrate. The lakebed was always going to be exposed. None of this was a surprise to anyone who was paying attention. The question that the Salton Sea asks, the question that it has been asking for 30 years, louder and louder as the shoreline retreats, is not a scientific one. It is a question about who we decide matters. And it is a question that California and the country has not yet answered in a way that the children of the Imperial Valley would recognize as an answer. If this made you think about water, about agriculture, about the gap between environmental promises and environmental reality, share it, because this is not a story about the past. The lakebed is drying right now. The dust is blowing right now. The children in the Imperial Valley have asthma rates that are not going down, and the question of whether California will actually fix it, actually spend what it would take, actually prioritize the communities that have been absorbing the cost of its agricultural system for a century, is still open. It has been open for 30 years. Subscribe to Vet Tips and come back next week, because the stories that don't make the news are almost always the ones that matter most.